Well, two books are the bookends for this talk, and the first one published in 1938, and the first book I had when I began studying architecture in the 60s. And at the other end is the sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert, which is climate as subject, but also predicated on the fact that over the last half billion years there have been 5 major extinctions on the planet, and that the sixth extinction may be us. You probably know that. I was born during the war, and no cars were made in the US that year because all of the manufacturing capacity had been turned over to making war machines. 1949 Ford was the first new model after the war, and it brought modernity to post-war America, along with advertising, hand in hand with television. And I loved cars growing up, and was always anxious to see the new models every year. During that time, the tail fins seemed to keep getting larger and larger, and they finally peaked in 1959 on the, of course, the 59 Cadillac. Cadillac was the top of the General Motors product line, and it was also the standard of the world. For some context of that era in which I grew up, Robert Frank, on the Guggenheim Foundation grant, traveled across the US in 1955 and 56. He took about 26,000 pictures, negatives, during that time, and finally edited them down to 83 pictures, which was published as The Americans in 1958. The same year that the Seagram building, designed by Mies van der Rohe, was completed in New York City and was described as the finest skyscraper in America. Things started to change in 1960. Elizabeth Colbert writes that Silent Spring exposed the dangers posed by synthetic pesticides, and within a decade most uses of DDT had been prohibited in the US. So it was an environmental win and the beginning of the environmental movement. When I began studying architecture in 1962, this building had just been published the winner of an international competition designed by a young architecture firm, Coleman, McKenna and Knowles, and it's a classic brutalist design. I loved it. When I started studying architecture at Tulane University, it was a segregated university. Civil rights movement was underway, change was coming, and it seemed an optimistic time. And then President Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963. Studying architecture, for me, there were many outside influences, including Andy Warhol's shift from being a painter to making films. And then in 1967, Marshall McLuhan, in collaboration with a graphic designer, published The Medium is a Massage, which was not the massage, doesn't he mean the message? It was not only a striking visual design, but it also introduced the idea of the global village. And I think it's the first time the idea of electronic interdependence was connected to a global situation. Woolworth Catalog, published in 1967. And then 1968, what a tumultuous year. The first half of that year was my last semester in college, and it was the Vietnam War was raging. The Tet Offensive occurred. Of course, Martin Luther King was assassinated in April, and Robert Kennedy in June. I got in my VW Beetle and headed to California. I came out for the Halpin workshop in 1968, and it was a workshop for architects and dancers. It was held over 30 days in July, and it really shifted, I think, my own process of how to work creatively. Shortly thereafter, Ant Farm was founded when Doug Michaels joined me in San Francisco. He came from the East Coast. And we described to a friend that what we wanted to do was found an underground architecture firm, because you had underground radio, underground newspapers, underground film. And this friend said, oh, like the toy I had as a kid, the Ant Farm, is underground architecture. Well, it was a perfect metaphor. It's a pretty good name, too. But of course, the ants are working collectively, collaboratively in the subsurface, and it's a very traditional architectural scene above ground. And it also gave us not only a logo and a name, but an official color, because Ant Farms only came in green in those days. And reflecting back on that period of time, I want to just read a short quote written by Felicity Scott. It's in the book she wrote that came out in 2008 about Ant Farm. It's called Allegorical Time Warp. And she wrote, the sensation of a spatial expansion of consciousness and a shrinking of physical distance was frequently informed, as was the case with Ant Farm, by encounters with psychedelic drugs, electronic technology, information networks, and the writings from Marshall McLuhan and Buckminster Fuller. We wanted a new kind of architecture, one that would be lightweight, portable, ephemeral perhaps. And it's true, we also wanted to float in space, but I think mainly we wanted to leave behind brutalism, the traditional form of modernism that we had studied for the previous 6 years. And this led to a series of experiments with inflatable structures, lightweight structures, air-supported structures, which occurred during this period of time, in 1969 to roughly to 1970. So what I want to do tonight is focus on 4 seminal and environmentally related projects from that period of time. The first one took place in April 1970. It was the first Earth Day. We were invited to an ecology fair on the UC Berkeley campus, and we brought an inflatable structure that people could enter, and we called it the Clean Air Pod. We also brought lab coats, which lent a certain kind of authority to the hippies of Ant Farm, pictured here. And we had one of those portable megaphones, and periodically we would announce, there's an air emergency, everyone in the Clean Air Pod. And people would file into the Clean Air Pod. Of course, there was no technical solution. There was no air filtering going on. That wasn't the point. I think it's interesting to note, though, that the Environmental Protection Agency was founded later that year during the Nixon administration. Well, why would young architects engage in a kind of performance art of aggressive, confrontational performances? Well, the reason is that the air quality really was dirty. It was a smog over the Bay Area and Los Angeles, very similar to what you see over Beijing today. So this project, Gas Station, was a direct result of that, and it was performed at a conference put on by Experiments in Art and Technology at the University of Southern California. The idea was it was done in a classroom, and you could see the audience in the background there. And basically, we lit a highway flare, put on our gas masks, and began projecting slides of gas stations on the wall of the room. And the duration of the piece was simply defined by how long it took for that highway flare to burn down. I think it was around 15 or 20 minutes. It wasn't a long performance. But when the last slide was shown and the flare had burned out and the lights came up, the room was completely empty. Project number 3 links to one of the prime generators of smog, the automobile, which is also a symbol of success as it appears in this photograph from the 1959 Cadillac sales brochure. Then there was another influence, which was a diagram, an evolutionary diagram, if you will, that was in a book called The Design of Cars. It took just 5 days to install the 10 Cadillac models, all sourced locally in the Texas Panhandle. And the Cadillac Ranch was completed on the summer solstice, 1974. It was and is a public work, but on privately owned land. So the public has interacted with it over the years, first just by scratching into the paint, and that's, of course, has escalated. And it was also receiving media attention, and in magazines like Time and both Time and Newsweek, it was seen as a symbol of decline. But it's more complicated than that, I think. There have been anniversary parties every 10 years, 84, 94, 2004. And in 2004, which was actually the last party, you can see a dark cloud on the horizon. What happened was the storm came in and it began to rain, and then it was suddenly hailing hail the size of tennis balls, and that was the end of that party and celebration. This is the day after. This is a piece by Damian Ortega. It was done in 2002. And the Cadillac Ranch, of course, is a ready-made, as is his project. And they both bring cultural information and formal qualities as the material of the artwork. And I read an interview with Damian that I liked what he said about the piece. He said, "I like that the work itself is smarter than the artist who made it." I agree with that. And it applies to Cadillac Ranch. In fact, not only smarter, but also more fashionable, and will certainly outlive the artists. It already has outlived one of them, because Doug Michaels died in 2003. So he missed out on that last party. And fashionable because it still has currency in the fashion world. 2018, a luxury fashion house based in Stockholm, Acme Studios, licensed it for a campaign that they shot there with Cindy Crawford. They got to paint the cars black and silver as part of the deal. And the fourth project, the aerosol arsenal, a time capsule, it was a decommissioned display refrigerator. It no longer cooled cakes, nor did it contain Freon. Instead, it displayed an array of aerosol cans, a time capsule for the next century, the one we're in now. And you may remember that in 1975, the story broke about how the Freon was emerging to destroy the ozone layer of the atmosphere. And there's very quickly action was taken to outlaw aerosol cans. And so we thought we better go buy them all and put them in a time capsule. But we had no plan for how to exhibit it, and it was never shown publicly. And it was a time capsule, but we made no plans for how to open it. And so when we had a fire at our studio in 1978, the aerosol arsenal was destroyed. And it was also the end of Ant Farm. Which brings, but not the end of the story, because this article from 6 months ago describes that the fact that the Montreal Protocol, which outlawed CFC 11 internationally, into which China is a signatory, was now having a problem in enforcing their own entrepreneurial capitalists who are making refrigerators and using CFC 11, because there was suddenly a spike. Scientists could measure this spike in attacks on the ozone layer. And furthermore, as we learned from the New York Times, in 2018, the Environmental Protection Agency has stopped enforcing the 2015 agreement that prohibited the use of hydrofluorocarbons in air conditioners and refrigerators. And that brings us to the 21st century. And Elizabeth Colbert, who wrote The Sixth Extinction, a year ago delivered the second annual Jonathan Schell Memorial Lecture on Fate of the Earth. The text can be found at thenewyorker.com. In this talk, she begins by describing the extinction of the Rab's fringe-limbed tree frog in central Panama. This species was only discovered in 2005 and only named in 2008. Biologists, writes Colbert, were trying to catalog what was out there before it was lost. I love this phrase, trying to catalog what was out there before it was lost, and it's a good description of the project I did in Miami Beach, which was initiated in 2016. And so it's a 29-minute film. I'm going to show a 5-minute, I'm going to go over 2 minutes over version of it. But it's called Miami Beach Elegy. It's not a documentary. It's simply a documentation of Miami Beach sitting there on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean as the sea rises during the 21st century. Miami as a canary in the mine shaft of climate change. Turn the lights down. The fluorescence.
Now, Miami Beach is in the middle, 2 years into a 5-year plan, $400 million plan to install pumping stations to correct this problem. We're now live on Miami Beach. Jerry Nelson. Turn it a little bit more. Oh, there we go. There we go. 1, 2, 3. Good, good.
You're wrong.
You can find the full-length version on my Vimeo page, which is not password protected. And these are other resources to access more work. Thank you.
Good.